The morning light that filtered through the high industrial windows of Iron and Chrome Customs arrived the way it always did in Portland in late October, gray, thin, and apologetic, as though it knew it wasn't entirely welcome. It came in sideways through the long rectangular panes, set high in the corrugated steel walls, cutting pale geometric shapes across the concrete floor. The shapes fell over oil-stained rags, scattered socket sets, and the skeletal frame of a 1971 Harley-Davidson shovelhead that had been in various states of disassembly for the better part of 3 months. Victoria Hargrove had been awake since 4:30. She stood at the workbench along the eastern wall, her back to the garage floor, her hands wrapped around a torque wrench with the easy familiarity of someone who had been holding tools longer than most people had been holding opinions. She was 42 years old, 5'8", lean and hard in the way that years of physical labor and military discipline produce not the kind of hardness that comes from a gym, but the kind that comes from carrying weight in the real world, from sleeping in the dirt of a foreign country, from getting up every single morning for 2 decades and deciding quietly and without drama to keep going. Her hair was dark brown, shot through at the temples with the threads of silver she had never once considered coloring. It was pulled back in a tight, practical knot at the base of her skull. Her forearms bare below a rolled-up flannel shirt were a map of her history, a faded Army Airborne insignia on her left forearm, the Iron and Chrome Customs patch design inked above her right wrist, and a long, thin scar that ran from the base of her right thumb to the inside of her elbow, courtesy of a roadside device outside of Mosul in 2007. She had not talked about that scar in years. She didn't need to. The torque wrench clicked, and she set it down on the bench with the quiet precision of someone who understood that the placement of tools was not a casual act. Behind her, the garage was beginning to wake up. The coffee machine in the corner near the parts storage room had kicked on at 6, as it always did, the rich, dark smell of it, mixing with the permanent background scent of the place. Motor oil, metal shavings, welding flux, and the faint, almost sweet undertone of gasoline that had soaked into the concrete over so many years it had become structural. Iron and Chrome Customs sat on the industrial fringe of Portland's northeast side, a part of the city that the real estate listings were only now beginning to describe with optimistic euphemisms. To the neighbors, to the city planners, and to the kind of people who wrote letters to their council representatives, it was a fortified, intimidating presence on the wrong end of a block that was trying unsuccessfully to gentrify. The building was a massive converted auto shop, its facade an unadorned wall of gray steel and aged brick, the rolling doors thick enough to muffle the sound of the compressors inside. To the members of the Ironbound MC, it was home. Victoria was the club's vice president. She was also the only woman in the charter who wore a full patch, not an associate designation, not a support title, but the full three-piece insignia of the club, earned over 8 years of proving repeatedly and without complaint that she was more capable under pressure than most men twice her size. The men of the club had accepted this not because they were progressive and not because of any political calculation. They had accepted it because Victoria Hargrove had, on 3 separate occasions that mattered, made decisions that saved the club from destruction. The first time had involved a territorial dispute with a crew out of Eugene that could have ended in a federal conspiracy charge. The second had involved a corrupt city building inspector who was quietly extorting the club's renewal permits. The third was a situation nobody in the club talked about in any detail, but whose resolution had resulted in a standing arrangement with a freight transport union that had been financially beneficial ever since. She made decisions, clean, fast, correct decisions. That was all the club had ever needed to know. Rex Malone came in through the side door at 6:45, the way he always did, carrying 2 mugs instead of 1, and setting the second on the edge of Victoria's workbench without being asked. Rex was 48 years old and built like a piece of heavy construction equipment, wide-shouldered, deep-chested, with the kind of physical presence that had a measurable effect on the air pressure in a room. He had a thick, dark beard going gray at the chin, and a face that looked like it had been arguing with the world for a long time and wasn't planning to stop. He was the club's enforcer, and he was the closest thing Victoria had to a trusted advisor, which was a role he occupied with characteristic bluntness and zero diplomatic polish. He sat down on an overturned milk crate near the shovel-head frame and wrapped both hands around his own mug. He looked at the machine for a long moment. "She is never going to run again," he said. "She will run," Victoria said without looking up from the workbench. "She just needs someone willing to be patient with her." Rex made a sound that communicated deep and sincere skepticism. Stone Briggs arrived 10 minutes later. Stone was 51, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a man of very few words and very firm convictions. He had a military background of his own, 2 tours with the Marine Corps, mid-90s Somalia and Haiti, and he and Victoria shared a particular shorthand that civilians found baffling and the rest of the club had learned to simply observe and respect. Stone came in, poured his coffee, walked the perimeter of the garage interior in a slow, unhurried loop, the way he did every morning, checking locks, checking sight lines, checking that everything was where it was supposed to be, and then settled in at the far end of the workbench with a parts catalog and a red pen. Colt Nash arrived last at 7:15, carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and a breakfast sandwich in his free hand. Colt was 29, the youngest patch member in the charter by a significant margin, and the most technologically capable human being Victoria had ever encountered. He was lanky and pale, with sharp features and dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging information in the way a certain kind of intelligence always does. He worked with the focused stillness of someone who had been genuinely good at something from a very early age, the kind of stillness that doesn't announce itself, that simply exists as a condition of serious work. He had come to the club not through any romantic notion of outlaw life, but through a practical arrangement involving the club's digital infrastructure and a particular set of skills that had made him invaluable fast. He wore his patch with a kind of low-key pride that Victoria respected. He didn't perform it, didn't posture around it, he just wore it. He dropped into the chair in front of the tech station in the back corner, opened the laptop, and within 30 seconds was in 4 different windows simultaneously. The morning moved the way mornings in the garage move, slowly, industriously, with the rhythm of tools and engines and the occasional exchange of necessary words. Victoria finished the torque calibration on the bench and moved to the shovel head, pulling a rolling stool under her, and beginning the slow, methodical process of evaluating which components of the primary chain case were salvageable. It was during this work, at approximately 8 in the morning, that the phone on the wall near the coffee station rang. Stone answered it, listened for approximately 15 seconds, and then carried the handset to Victoria without changing his expression. "It's Drummond," he said, "the lawyer." Victoria wiped her hands on a shop rag and took the phone. Philip Drummond was the club's attorney, a careful, meticulous man in his late 50s who had been representing the Ironbound MC in various legal matters for 11 years and who communicated exclusively in the measured, slightly mournful tones of someone who had learned long ago that good news was rare and bad news was best delivered directly. "Victoria," he said, "I received notification this morning from the city. The Planning Commission has filed for a third structural assessment of the property. The inspector they've assigned is from an outside firm the commission retains, not city staff." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "And the timeline?" "They're requesting access within 10 days, Drummond said. "The language in the filing is specific. If the assessment identifies any structural deficiencies, the commission can move to a mandatory compliance order. And if the club fails to meet compliance standards within their window, they can apply for an emergency condemnation hearing." Victoria understood immediately what that meant. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning underneath it was simple. Warren Holt, the newly appointed chairman of the Portland City Planning Commission, was using the machinery of civic governance to dismantle the club's home. He had done this twice before: noise ordinance filings, a zoning dispute over the commercial classification of the property, an environmental review of the fuel storage tanks that had consumed 6 months and a significant amount of the club's legal budget. Each time the club had responded through proper channels, and each time the challenge had been successfully contested. But the legal fees were accumulating, and more importantly, the pattern was becoming clear. Warren Holt was not trying to win any single battle. He was trying to exhaust them. She thanked Drummond, told him to file a formal objection to the timeline, and hung up the phone. Rex had been watching her from across the garage. The room was quiet in the ordinary way of a working morning, the compressor cycling on and off in its corner, the smell of coffee still warm in the air. Holt again, she said. Third structural filing. Rex set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. The sound it made on the concrete floor was small and precise. At some point, he said, we need to have a different conversation about Warren Holt. Victoria looked at him steadily. Not yet, she said. We do this right. Rex's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He understood because he had learned to understand that Victoria's version of doing something right was not the same as the conventional version of that phrase. It didn't mean passive. It didn't mean permissive. It meant waiting until you had complete information and then acting with precision. It meant not making a move that could be countered. It meant thinking 3 steps further ahead than the person on the other side of the problem. She had learned this in the Army. She had refined it raising a child alone. Emma Hargrove was 7 years old, and she was the single most important fact of Victoria's life. She had been born in the spring of 2017 in a hospital in Portland on a rainy Tuesday evening that Victoria remembered with the specific, almost painful clarity reserved for the handful of days that genuinely reorder a person's interior landscape. Emma had come into the world with dark eyes and a head of fine light hair that had gradually brightened over her first 2 years into a genuine warm blonde. She had Victoria's bone structure and her father's easy open smile, the smile that could light a room before the person attached to it had said a single word. Her father's name was Derek Caulfield, and he had left when Emma was 3 years old. Victoria did not hate him for leaving. She had moved past hate years ago through the long, quiet work of acceptance that single parents do largely alone, and largely in the hours between midnight and 5 in the morning, when the world is dark and still, and the only sound is the breathing of a sleeping child down the hall. Derek had married a woman who rode motorcycles and carried a weapon and had seen things overseas that she would never entirely put into words. He had not understood going in what that actually meant. He had understood it eventually, and he had found it was more than he wanted to carry. She couldn't fault him for knowing his limits. What she could do, and what she had done, was build something in his absence that was stronger than what had been there before. Emma grew up in the garage the way some children grow up on farms or in libraries, immersed in the particular language and rhythm of the place from an age before memory. She knew the names of tools before she knew the names of most of her classmates. She could identify the sound of a misfiring cylinder before she could read. She called the patched members of the club her uncles, which they were in every way that mattered. And she moved through the garage with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has always known exactly where she belongs. On the morning of October 14th, the garage had the unhurried quality of a Tuesday that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. Emma had come downstairs from the apartment above at 6:50, still in her pajamas, carrying the small, stuffed bear she had owned since she was 2, and had never fully committed to leaving upstairs. She sat on the battered leather sofa in the glass-walled office at the back of the garage and ate the toast Victoria had brought down for her and watched the morning come in through the high windows with the patient observational quality. She had always had the quality of a child who was deeply interested in the world and in no hurry about it. Victoria had sat across from her on the edge of the desk and watched her eat and thought, as she thought every morning with some variation, that this was the part of the day she was working for. Not the garage, not the club, not the accumulated obligations of the life she had built around this building and these people. This, Emma with her bear and her toast and her careful attention to the morning light. At 7:30, Victoria had driven Emma to the corner of Southeast Hawthorne and 34th. The school bus picked up at 7:50. Emma had climbed out of the truck with her pink backpack and her lunchbox and turned back once to give Victoria the brief formal wave of a child who is practicing independence, and finding it easier in theory than in practice. And Victoria had waited until the bus appeared around the corner, and Emma had boarded before she pulled out into traffic and drove back to the garage. Every weekday afternoon, the bus returned Emma to the same corner at 3:20, and Emma walked the 6 blocks back to the garage through a route they had established together and practiced together, and that Emma could navigate in her sleep. Past the hardware store, past the community garden with the faded mural on its east-facing fence, past the bakery run by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who always had a paper bag of day-old snickerdoodles waiting on the counter when Emma came by. Through the shortcut between the bakery and the dry cleaner next door, a narrow concrete alley that came out half a block from the garage's side entrance. Victoria had walked the route with Emma 14 times before she let her do it alone. She had timed it. She had identified every camera in every storefront, in every neighbor whose schedule she could predict. She had given Emma a list of 3 houses on the route where she could knock on the door if something felt wrong. She had told her daughter in language a 7-year-old could absorb what to do if a car slowed down near her, what to do if a stranger called her name, what to do if someone said they knew her mother. Run, she had told Emma. You run and you don't look back and you go straight to the garage. That's what you do. The afternoon of October 14th was overcast and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, with a thin, constant wind coming down from the west that carried the smell of rain not yet arrived. Victoria was lying on a creeper beneath the front end of a 1998 Road King that belonged to a club associate running a flashlight along the frame rails looking for the hairline crack that was causing a persistent vibration in the front end at highway speed. Rex was at the far workbench with a set of carb jets spread out on a clean cloth. Stone was in the back running inventory. Holt was at his station, headphones on, working through something on the screen with the concentrated focus of a man diffusing an explosive device. The side door of the garage opened at 3:37. It opened the way it always opened when Emma came home, with the particular combination of force and uncertainty that a 7-year-old brings to a door that is slightly too heavy for her. Victoria registered the sound from under the Road King and began to slide out on the creeper, smiling already. Then she heard the sound Emma was making, and the smile was gone before she was fully upright. Emma was not crying the way children cry when they fall and hurt themselves, that sharp, startled sound of unexpected pain. She was crying the way they cry when something has frightened them down to the bone, when the body's alarm system has been triggered so completely that the tears come before the words, before the breath, before any organized thought at all. She was standing just inside the door, her pink backpack hanging off one shoulder, her face flushed and wet, her small chest heaving. "Mama," she gasped, "Mama." Victoria was across the garage floor in 3 seconds. She dropped to her knees in front of Emma, both hands on her daughter's shoulders, and looked directly into her face. "Emma, look at me. Are you hurt? Did someone touch you?" Emma shook her head, her pigtails dragging against her wet cheeks. "No, I ran, Mama. I ran like you told me. I cut through Mrs. Gable's alley and I ran." The garage had gone absolutely still. Rex was standing. Stone had come out from the back. Holt had the headphones around his neck, both hands flat on the desk. Victoria kept her voice at exactly the register she needed it at, calm, steady, unhurried. Every cell in her body was running a different calculation, but none of it showed on her face. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. "Start at the beginning." Emma breathed. She was working hard to get herself under control the way children do when they understand that the adult in front of them needs information and that the information is important. Victoria recognized the effort and felt a ferocious, wordless pride in it. "I was walking home," Emma said. "I was past the garden. A car came up real slow. It was silver and shiny, new-looking. The man inside rolled down his window." Victoria's hands did not tighten on Emma's shoulders. She kept them gentle and steady. "What did he say?" "He said he could give me a ride. He said it was going to rain. And then he said," Emma paused and her lower lip trembled. "He said he knew you, Mama. He said Victoria sent him because your bike broke down and you needed Emma to come to a different place." The temperature in the garage dropped 10 degrees. He used my full name, Victoria said. Not Mama, not your mom. He said Victoria. Emma nodded. Victoria held her daughter's gaze for 2 more seconds, making sure the calibration was correct, making sure Emma understood that she was safe and that everything was under control. Then she stood up. She looked at Rex. Rex's face was a wall. His eyes were doing the math. She looked at Stone. Stone was already moving. He went to the main rolling door and through the manual lock. Then the side door. His movements were methodical and without haste, the movements of a man who has done this before and will do it again and does not require any additional instruction. She looked at Colt. Get on the cameras, she said quietly. Every ATM, every traffic feed, every doorbell unit within 6 blocks of the Hawthorne bus stop. I want every second of footage from the last hour. Colt was already pulling up his first window. She picked up Emma, holding her against her chest, and walked to the glass-walled office at the back of the garage. She set her daughter on the leather sofa, pulled the old wool blanket from the armrest, and tucked it around her. She opened the mini fridge and put a juice box in Emma's hand. You did everything right, Victoria told her, sitting on the edge of the cushion beside her. Everything I taught you. You ran. You got home safe. That was brave, baby. That was exactly right. Emma looked up at her with dark, serious eyes. Is the man going to come here? No, Victoria said. This is the safest place in the city, and I'm going to find out who he is. She stepped to the door and locked it from the outside. She stood still for exactly 1 moment alone in the narrow corridor between the office and the garage floor, her back to the glass, her face to the empty hallway. She let herself feel it, the cold surge of it, the primal roar that every parent carries underneath. Everything, the one that says you do not touch what is mine, the one that has no language and no philosophy attached to it. She let herself feel it fully for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put it away. She walked back onto the garage floor. The men were waiting. Rex spoke first, his voice flat and careful. He knew your name? That's not random. No, Victoria said, it's not random. He researched, he knew Emma's schedule, he knew the route, he knew what name to use. She crossed to the workbench where she had been lying under the Road King and picked up the shop rag. She wiped her hands methodically, finger by finger, the way she always did when her mind was working through a problem at high speed and her hands needed something to do. Someone looked into us, she said, found out I have a daughter, found out the routine, found out my name. Rex said and decided that because we're a club, we wouldn't call the law. He was right about that, Stone said from across the garage. His voice was deep and even. We're not calling anyone. Victoria shook her head. No, we're not calling anyone, she agreed. And she heard in her own voice something she recognized, something she hadn't heard since Iraq, the particular cold leveling that happens when fear gets compressed into focus, when the emotional turbulence goes quiet because the situation has become too serious for noise. She pulled a stool to Colt's station and sat down beside him. How long, she asked. 40 minutes for a full pull, he said. Maybe less. The liquor store on the corner of Hawthorne and 32nd just updated their external camera system last month. Better resolution than the city cams. Do it clean, she told him. Nothing traceable, already building the bridge, he said. Rex pulled a stool to the opposite side of the station and crossed his arms over his chest. He watched Colt work without comment. Stone had moved to the main door and was standing with his back to the wall beside it, arms loose at his sides, in the posture of a man who is prepared to remain in exactly that position for as long as necessary. The garage settled into a different kind of quiet now. Not the quiet of an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, the quiet of a held breath, the quiet of people who have been in serious situations before and understand that serious situations require the conservation of energy. Victoria got up after 10 minutes and walked to the window that looked out onto the side street. The overcast sky had darkened. The rain that had been threatening all day was beginning to arrive in thin, intermittent lines, the kind of rain that Portland does in October. Not dramatic, not violent, just relentless and gray and absolutely indifferent. She thought about the man in the silver car. He had used her full name. That meant research. Research meant access either through public records, through someone who knew the club, or through someone with the kind of institutional reach that allowed them to pull information that wasn't publicly available. A civilian with a grudge doesn't find the schedule of a 7-year-old girl whose mother is the VP of an MC. A civilian with a grudge doesn't know that the VP's name is Victoria, and that Emma calls her mama at home, and the name to use the name that would create the right impression in a child's mind was her full name. He had thought this through. That told her something about the kind of person she was dealing with. Not impulsive, not disorganized, patient in the way that predators are patient, willing to accumulate information, willing to wait for the right moment, willing to do the preparatory work that makes the act itself cleaner. She had known men like this. She had encountered them overseas, and she had encountered them in 12 years of club life, and she had encountered them in the dark space between those two worlds, where the worst versions of human nature tend to operate without oversight or consequence. She pulled herself back from the speculation. Data first, everything else was noise, and noise cost time, Vic Holt said. His voice had a specific stillness to it that she had learned to read. She moved back to the station. The main monitor showed a black and white camera feed, timestamped looking northeast along southeast Hawthorne. The image was better than she had expected. The liquor store's new system had genuine resolution. Play it, she said. Colt hit the key. The footage showed the sidewalk in real time from 318 onward. Pedestrian traffic light, a dog walker, 2 teenagers on bikes, a delivery van parked against the curb for approximately 4 minutes before pulling away. And then at 327, a vehicle that moved the way no vehicle should ever move on a residential street, slowly, precisely, with the deliberate, measured pace of something that knows exactly what it is doing. The car was silver, late model, expensive in a way that announced itself without being ostentatious the way things announce themselves when the person who owns them has never needed to worry about the cost. Victoria watched it. She watched the car pace a small figure with a pink backpack. She watched the window go down. She watched the car stop. She watched Emma's body language shift, the small hesitation, the moment of decision, and then Emma was running, cutting between 2 parked cars and disappearing up a side street toward Mrs. Gable's bakery. The car sat for 3 seconds. Then it rolled slowly forward and turned down the alley behind the bakery. Colt had a second feed ready. He switched windows. This one was from a different angle, a delivery camera mounted on the back of the bakery building, itself pointing down the alley toward the street. The image was lower resolution, but still readable. The silver car came around the corner and accelerated. As it hit a rise in the alley where a utility cover had settled unevenly, the rear end dropped and the bumper caught the pavement, and for 1 second, 2 seconds, the rear of the car was in full light from the street lamp at the alley's end. Colt paused the frame. There on the lower rear panel of the car was a small oval dealership decal. The letters were readable. Bancroft European Imports, Rex said, leaning in close. That's in the West Hills, Stone said from behind them. High-end lot, Mercedes, BMW, Porsche. Colt was already moving. His fingers went through the keyboard in a sequence that Victoria watched without fully understanding and had long ago stopped asking him to explain. She understood the outcome. She didn't need the methodology. I'm in their service database, Colt said after 4 minutes. He kept his voice level. Looking for silver S-Class models sold in the last 3 years with aftermarket alloy packages. He paused, narrowing by wheel spec. The rims on that car are a specific aftermarket package, not standard issue. There's a package from a German specialty manufacturer that Bancroft orders for about 12% of their high-end buyers. If this guy bought his rims through the dealership, he stopped talking. The room was very quiet. He turned the monitor slightly so Victoria could see it clearly. On the screen was a service record, and attached to the service record was a customer profile. And attached to the customer profile was a name and a headshot pulled from the DMV cross-reference Colt had run simultaneously. The man in the headshot was in his early 50s, Salt and pepper hair precisely cut, clean-shaved. He had the face of a man who had spent a long time in rooms where decisions were made, not the face of authority in the physical sense, but the face of institutional authority, the kind that lives behind mahogany desks and believes genuinely and without doubt that it is untouchable. The name below the photo was Warren Holt. Victoria looked at the screen for a long, still moment. Rex made a sound low in his chest, the sound of a man recalibrating rapidly. "Is that," Stone began, the chairman of the Portland City Planning Commission, Victoria said. "The man who has been filing structural assessments against this property for the past 8 months." Nobody spoke. Rex's hands, usually in constant motion, had gone completely still. Stone had moved closer without anyone noticing the way Stone always moved. The implications were landing in each of them at their own rate, and the room held that process without interference. Rex said, "He's going after the club legally and personally at the same time. He's trying to force you to back down. Grab Emma, threaten the family, make it personal enough that you drop the legal fight and walk." Victoria did not answer immediately. She stood at the edge of Colt's station, her arms crossed, and she looked at Warren Holt's face on the screen. She looked at the easy confidence in it, the reflexive, deeply habituated certainty of a man who had never paid a price for anything he had done. She thought about what Rex had said. It was logical. It was the interpretation that the available evidence supported. A powerful city official using personal leverage against the family of someone who was fighting him in the legal arena. A pressure tactic, an escalation, an ugly but ultimately familiar kind of move in a kind of conflict that men like Holt had been waging against people like her club for decades. She looked at the face for another 3 seconds. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. Rex frowned. "What do you mean, no?" If Warren Holt wanted to break the club's resistance to his zoning campaign, Victoria said, her voice quiet and precise, he would hire someone. He would use distance and deniability. He would send a message through channels. He would not personally drive a luxury car registered to his own dealership account down a residential street and approach a child in broad daylight. Rex absorbed this. Stone had come closer without anyone noticing the way Stone always moved. A man with political power and legal resources. Victoria continued, does not take that kind of operational risk for a bureaucratic agenda. The risk to reward ratio is completely wrong. The exposure is catastrophic. If Emma had gotten a photo on her phone, if any passerby had seen the interaction clearly, his career, his freedom, his everything, it's over. No sane political operator takes that risk to pressure someone's zoning hearing. She looked at the face on the screen again. "This isn't a pressure tactic," she said. Her voice had gone very flat the way it went when the analysis was complete and the conclusion was certain, and there was no point in emotional inflection because the situation was entirely past that. "This is something else. He used the club investigation to find me. He found out I had a daughter. He found out the routine. He thought that because we operate outside the law, the risk to him was lower." She looked at Rex. "We aren't the target of this," she said. "Emma is." The full weight of that settled into the room. Rex had gone very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Stone's face had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted the look of a man who has identified a threat and converted it entirely to a single purpose. Colt very quietly took his headphones off and set them on the desk with great care. Victoria breathed. She looked at the glass-walled office. Emma was visible through the window, curled under the wool blanket, the juice box resting on the armrest beside her. Her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of a child who has exhausted herself and found her safe place and let herself rest. She watched her daughter sleep for exactly 5 seconds. Then she turned back to the garage. "Colt," she said, "get me everything on Warren Holt. Property holdings, financial records, communications if you can reach them. Whatever is behind that dealership account and whatever is behind the City Planning Commission files." "On it," Colt said, and his fingers were already moving. "Rex," she said, "get Stone and the prospects out on the perimeter. Nobody on this block without you knowing about it. If a silver car of any description comes within 3 blocks of this building, I want to know before it stops. Rex nodded once and moved. Stone, she said. You're on Emma's door. Nobody goes into that office. Nobody. Stone crossed the garage floor and took up a position just outside the office door without a word. He stood the way soldiers stand, not rigid, not theatrical, but present, fully, completely, immovably present. Victoria went to her toolbox, not the upper drawers where the wrenches lived, the deep lower drawer beneath the specialty bits in the circuit. Testers where the false bottom sat flush with the surrounding metal if you didn't know exactly where to press. She pressed the right place. The panel lifted. She removed a matte black Glock 19, checked the chamber, checked the magazine, and seated it at the small of her back under the flannel shirt. She went back to the tech station and stood behind Colt watching the screens populate with data. She did not feel fear. She felt the thing that lived on the other side of fear, the cold, clear, utterly functional state that she had first encountered in a vehicle at a checkpoint outside Tikrit when she was 23 years old, and someone had made a decision that required her to respond, and she had responded correctly, and the world had kept moving. The state where the heart rate is elevated but controlled, where the vision narrows and clarifies simultaneously, where the only thing that exists is the problem and the solution and the distance between them. She had lived in this state on and off for 19 years. She was good at it. Outside the garage, the Portland rain had arrived in full. It came down in the gray, patient way it always did, steady and indifferent, running in thin rivers along the edges of the loading dock, drumming quietly on the steel roof far overhead. The garage lights buzzed in the wet chill. The shovelhead sat in its corner patient as its name waiting for someone to return to it. Inside the glass office, Emma slept, and Victoria Hargrove sat in the growing dark of a Wednesday October evening, watching the screens and waited for the full shape of the truth to emerge. She had learned in 2 wars and 1 difficult life that the truth always emerged. You could delay it, you could obscure it, you could bury it under bureaucratic filings and political process and institutional authority and the comfortable assumption that certain kinds of people were protected from consequences. But the truth always came out, and tonight she was going to help it along. The data came in pieces the way serious information always does, not in a clean, organized revelation, but in fragments that accumulated weight as they accumulated detail, each new piece pressing down on the ones beneath it until the structure of the thing became visible, and the structure was worse than anything Rex had said out loud, and worse than anything Victoria had allowed herself to think during the first hour. Colt worked without speaking. He had 3 windows running simultaneously: the customer database he had accessed through the dealership's service portal, a public records aggregator that compiled property and financial filings, and a 3rd window that was darker and more complex, the kind of access that did not have a clean institutional explanation. Victoria stood behind him and watched the screens and said nothing, and the garage around them was quiet in the specific way it gets quiet when the men in it understand that the woman at the center of the operation is thinking, and that thinking requires space. Warren Holt's public profile assembled itself across the left monitor. The Planning Commission chairmanship, the prior appointment to the city's Infrastructure Review Board, a property portfolio that included 3 residential parcels in the West Hills, a commercial building near the Pearl District, and a vacation property outside Cannon Beach. A civic engagement was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, the carefully curated history of a man who had spent 30 years building the specific kind of institutional credibility that functions as its own protection. The kind of record that makes investigators start with the assumption of legitimacy and work backward, which means they almost never arrive at the truth. The right monitor was something else. Colt had gotten into the Bancroft service account through a back channel in their customer management software, and from there into the linked email address, and from there through a series of steps he executed with the quiet efficiency of someone walking a familiar path into the outer layers of Holt's personal communications infrastructure. He wasn't inside yet, but he was close enough to see the shape of what was there. There are partition drives on his home network, Holt said. Encrypted. Consumer-grade hardware running an encryption suite that isn't consumer-grade. Somebody set this up deliberately. Victoria said, "Can you get in not from here? I need to be on his local network." Physical proximity. Rex had come back inside from the perimeter check and was standing at the edge of the tech station. He looked at Victoria. She could feel him calculating the way she could always feel Rex calculating when something had changed the parameters of a situation. "We need to go to him," Rex said. Victoria was already thinking it. She was running the variables, the timing, the logistics, the risk profile, the available resources, the unknowns that hadn't resolved themselves yet. She was doing it in the background of her awareness, while the foreground stayed focused on the screen, the way she had learned to run multiple cognitive tracks simultaneously in the Army, the skill that had made her a good intelligence analyst and a better field officer, and eventually a better club vice president than anyone had initially expected. "What are the prospects doing right now?" she asked. Rex said Hawthorne and Burnside in the van. Morrison Bridge approach, and one on foot north side of the block. She nodded. She moved to the office door. Through the glass, Emma was still asleep. The juice box had tipped slightly against the armrest. Victoria opened the door without waking her, reached in and righted the juice box, stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, and then closed the door and turned back to the room. "Stone," she said, "you stay here. Emma does not leave that office. Nobody comes in without my direct instruction by voice confirmed. You understand what I mean by confirmed?" Stone looked at her without blinking. "Understood," he said. She looked at Rex. "We go to the Palisades. We go clean. No engines until we hit the highway. Baffled pipes. We leave the van here with the prospects on the building." Rex's jaw moved slightly. He looked at the office window, then back at Victoria. He wanted to say something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the specific tension that accumulated in Rex when he disagreed with a decision, but was working through whether the disagreement was worth the friction. He said, "If this is what I think it might be." "It might be," Victoria said. "Then we should go in ready for anything." "We will be ready for anything," she said. "But we go in quiet. We go in clean. We find out what's on those drives first. Then we decide." Rex breathed out through his nose. He picked up his leather cut from the bench hook and pulled it on. He did not say anything else. Colt began packing his kit. He moved fast and efficiently, selecting specific items from the tech storage cabinet with the practiced discretion of someone who has thought in advance about what a night like this requires. A compact laptop, a portable wireless bridge, 3 high-capacity drives in an anti-static case, a set of physical bypass tools that Victoria understood by function, if not by technical name. He assembled it all into a black bag that looked from a distance like a gym bag, and he zipped it and slung it over his shoulder. Victoria went to the cabinet near the main door. She checked the Glock again, not from uncertainty but from discipline, because checking the weapon before an operation was not optional, it was structural. It was the kind of habit that the people who came home had, and the people who didn't come home had skipped. She added a second magazine to her left jacket pocket. She pulled on her cut. The 3 of them went out the side door into the rain. The Harleys were in the covered bay off the south side of the building. They pushed them out by hand onto the wet asphalt, working in silence, the machines heavy and warm and smelling of oil and metal. They walked them down the access alley to the cross street, 2 full blocks from the garage, before Colt and Rex mounted and started their engines. The sound was low and contained the baffled pipes doing their work, reducing the exhaust note from its usual full-throated authority to something closer to a deep rolling murmur that the rain and the ambient city noise absorbed without difficulty. Victoria sat on her machine for a moment before starting it. She looked back once in the direction of the garage. The building was invisible from here behind the block in the rain and the dark. But she knew exactly what was in it. She knew the temperature of the office and the position of the wool blanket and the particular way Emma breathed when she was deeply asleep. A slight pause at the top of each inhale, Then a wide-bound slow release, as though even in sleep she was considering things carefully before letting them go. She started the engine. They rode northeast through the rain, three blacked-out machines moving through the arterial streets of Portland with the low-profile discipline of people who have ridden these routes at night before and understand that visibility is a choice. Victoria ran point. Rex fell into her left rear. Colt brought up the trailing position. They didn't ride tight, they rode spread with the natural spacing of traffic, unremarkable to any camera they passed. The West Hills rose out of the rain-soaked basin of the city in a long, slow elevation that the residential streets climbed in switchbacking curves. The air changed as they ascended, cleaner, cooler, carrying the smell of cedar and wet stone and the expensive stillness of a neighborhood where the houses were set back from the road behind hedges and gates and the kind of landscaping that required professional maintenance rather than personal attention. Victoria had been in neighborhoods like this before, not socially, operationally. They pulled off the road a quarter-mile from the entrance of the gated community at the address Colt had pulled from Holt's property records. The entrance was visible ahead: two brick pillars, a wrought iron gate, a small guardhouse with amber interior light. The gate was closed. A camera on a pivot arm monitored the approach from above the left pillar. Colt, Victoria said. Already on it, he said. He had the wireless bridge unit out of the bag, and he was kneeling beside his machine with the compact laptop open against his thigh, his back to the rain, working in the shelter of his own body. The Residential Association's security network runs on a commercial management platform, he said. Single localized server, standard firmware. I can set a rolling substitution loop on the external cameras. The system will cycle the same footage of an empty approach on repeat. It won't force a reset. It will just keep cycling until I kill it manually or until someone physically checks the monitor bank and notices the timestamp isn't advancing. How long can you hold it? Victoria asked. As long as we need, he said. The guard in the booth is looking at his phone. Unless someone calls the desk and asks him to verify the live feed directly, we have the time we need. Victoria looked at the gate. Then go, she said. A soft click moved through the night air as the iron gate swung open. The security guard in the booth did not look up. His phone cast a pale rectangle of light across the lower half of his face. They pushed the motorcycles through without starting the engines. Rex stood at the edge of the road in the dark, arms crossed, watching the entrance. His posture communicated nothing except absolute readiness, the physical articulation of a man who has been waiting in the dark before dangerous things for a very long time and has made peace with every dimension of that experience. They stashed the machines in the shadow of a dense hedge at the property line of a house 3 doors from Holt's address and went the rest of the way on foot. Victoria was thinking about the face in the DMV photo as they moved through the dark between the street lamps. The institutional confidence in it. The practiced warmth of the smile, the kind that is not the expression of a feeling, but the product of a calculation, the smile of someone who has learned over a long time how to appear trustworthy in rooms full of people who are deciding whether or not to trust him. She had met this species before. Not often, but enough to know it. Men who had wrapped their real nature in layers of civic legitimacy and professional respectability, and who had operated inside those layers for so long that they had come to believe the layers were the truth, who had never been compelled to account for the thing underneath because the thing underneath had been careful and patient and had chosen its targets from populations that the institutions were not designed to protect. She kept the word that her mind kept returning to inside where it was doing its work. 4420 Crestview Drive was exactly the kind of house the address suggested. A monument to a particular aesthetic of modern wealth. Clean lines, extensive glass, white concrete planes interrupted by dark steel frames. The kind of architecture that communicates an ambition to be considered sophisticated rather than merely rich. The circular driveway was immaculate. The boxwood hedges flanking the front steps were clipped to precise geometric forms, and the security floodlights positioned under the eaves cast the whole property in an even clinical illumination. The silver Mercedes was in the driveway. Victoria stood at the property's perimeter for exactly 30 seconds reading the house. Ground floor dark except for a faint ambient glow from what was probably a kitchen or utility space on the west side. Second floor, one room lit the southeast corner. Warm light the color of a single lamp rather than overhead fixtures. A window partially open despite the rain, which meant the heat in the house was up, which meant the person in that room had been there for a while. She looked at Rex. He looked at the house. He looked at her. She said nothing. She moved. Rex found the side door of the three-car garage in 90 seconds using nothing more complicated than a tension wrench and picked the specific combination of tools and skill that Stone had taught him 12 years ago and that he had practiced with the unromantic consistency of someone who treats a useful capability as infrastructure rather than identity. The door opened inward on a space that smelled of motor oil and new rubber and the faint chemical sweetness of detailing products. They moved through the garage, through the connecting door into the house's utility room, and up a back staircase to the second floor. The hallway was carpeted in something thick and pale. Their boots made no sound. The warm light was coming from a door ahead slightly open, and through the gap came the sound that Victoria had not expected, and that settled something in her chest with a cold, definitive weight. Classical music, low volume, the particular kind of deliberate, cultivated ambient choice that a certain kind of man uses to construct a private atmosphere. She pushed the door with two fingers. Warren Holt was at his desk. He was wearing a dark silk robe over what appeared to be dress clothes, as though he had come home, removed his jacket, but not fully transitioned out of the day. He was sitting in a high-backed leather chair behind a desk the size of a workbench, a crystal glass in his hand containing something amber, his eyes on a laptop screen. His salt and pepper hair is exactly as it appeared in the DMI photo. His posture was the posture of a man entirely at ease in his own space. He looked up when the door opened, and for a fraction of a second his face registered the automatic annoyance of someone whose private time has been interrupted without invitation. The expression of institutional authority interrupted. The reflex of a man who is accustomed to being able to communicate without words that his time is valuable and his space is not to be entered without permission. Then his eyes moved from Victoria's face to the cut on her shoulders to the men behind her, to the Glock at her side, and the annoyance became something else entirely. The glass slipped. It didn't fall far. His hand caught the stem, but the liquid sloshed over the rim and ran down across his fingers and dripped onto the desk in small, quick drops. He looked at his own hand, then back at Victoria. She walked to the edge of the desk and stood in the direct light of the lamp. She did not raise the weapon. She stood where she was standing and looked at him and let the room contain what it contained. "Who are you?" Holt said. His voice had the quality of a man reaching for authority and finding the shelf empty. "What are you doing in My name is Victoria Hargrove," she said. "I'm the vice president of the Ironbound MC. You've been filing structural assessments against our property for 8 months. She paused. "And this afternoon you drove your silver Mercedes to the corner of Southeast Hawthorne and 34th Street and attempted to put my 7-year-old daughter in your car." All the blood left Warren Holt's face. Not gradually, it went all at once, as though a valve had been released somewhere below the surface, and what remained was not the color of a living man, but the flat, grayish pallor of something already in the process of becoming something else. The civic authority drained out of his expression like water out of a cracked container, and what was underneath it was small and frightened and entirely recognizable to someone who had interrogated people under pressure before. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. It was a reflex, not a decision. The words came out of the automated self-protection system before the rational mind could evaluate whether they were useful. Victoria looked at him without expression. "Your car is in your driveway," she said. "The dealership sticker is visible from the street." My daughter described the vehicle. My technical team pulled camera footage from 4 sources within 6 blocks of the incident. The timestamp, the vehicle, the behavior, and the plate history are documented. So before you use that phrase again, I want you to understand that we are past the point where that phrase means anything. Holt opened his mouth. He closed it. Rex moved around the desk with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already decided what is going to happen and is simply executing the decision. He placed one large hand on the back of Holt's neck and pressed him firmly forward until his chest was against the desk surface, and his eyes were looking at the laptop screen from a distance of approximately 8 inches. "Don't lie to her," Rex said. Holt made a sound, half protest, half something much less dignified. His hands were flat against the desk. Fingers spread the posture of a man who is trying to make himself as small as possible. Colt moved around the other side of the desk. He was looking at the laptop screen. His face changed. Victoria felt it before Colt said anything. The specific shift in the room's atmosphere that happens when the parameters of a situation change suddenly and fundamentally, when the frame around the problem turns out to have been too small, and the real picture is larger and darker and more serious than the frame suggested. Vic Colt said, his voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when he was genuinely affected by something which was not often. Colt Nash was a young man who had seen a considerable amount of the world's unpleasant data and had developed through prolonged exposure a certain professional detachment from it. When that detachment slipped, it was worth paying attention to. Victoria came around the desk. The laptop screen showed a folder structure. The folders were not organized the way personal files are organized, not by date or project or category. They were organized by a system that took her a moment to read, and then the moment was over, and she had read it, and she understood what she was looking at. Each folder was a dossier. There were dozens of them. Each one contained the same type of information structured in the same way: photographs, schedules, addresses, school information, family background. Each one was for a child. She looked at enough of them. She didn't need to read every page to understand the architecture of what she was reading. She read the names and the ages and the neighborhood designations attached to each file. The children in these dossiers came from East Portland, from North Portland, from the trailer parks along the Columbia Slough, from addresses and zip codes that the city's civic infrastructure had been systematically underfunding for 20 years, which meant they were addresses where a child going missing might be recorded as a runaway, where the police report might sit in a queue for months, where the family might not have the resources to generate the kind of sustained public pressure that keeps a case moving. Emma's name was in there, at the bottom of a list that had nothing to do with the Ironbound MC, and nothing to do with zoning hearings, and nothing to do with any dispute that had anything to do with the club at all. Victoria stood completely still. Rex looked up from Holt's neck and looked at the screen. He looked for a long time. What was on the screen had exceeded the frame that each of them had brought into the room, and each of them was working privately and without language to build a larger one. Rex's face carried something she had never seen on it in 11 years. The expression of a man whose understanding of what people are capable of has been revised downward in a single instant, whose body is running on pure instinct because the part of the brain that processes things in rational language has temporarily stopped functioning. Colt had turned toward the window, his eyes on the rain against the glass, his jaw set. His hands on the desk were very still. Holt, pinned under Rex's hand, had begun to make a different kind of sound. The self-protective reflexes had given way to something more elemental, the sound of a man who understands in his body before his mind that the scenario he is in has become one from which he cannot extract himself with the tools he has spent his life cultivating. Colt found it in the metadata of Emma's folder 3 minutes later, while Victoria was still reading the email chain. The creation date on the file was 6 weeks old. The source data embedded in the document properties traced back to a public records request filed through the Planning Commission's own administrative office, a background research poll on Victoria Hargrove initiated as part of the zoning investigation against the club. Holt had been building a legal case against the Ironbound MC, and in the process of building that case, he had assembled a profile of its vice president. He had found Emma in that profile. He had found the school, the bus stop, the route home. He had made a calculation that a child raised inside a motorcycle club's garage by a mother the city considered a criminal was a child whose disappearance would be managed by the same institutional indifference that managed everything else in that world. He had made a second calculation that her mother would not go to the police. Both calculations had been correct in their logic and catastrophically wrong in their conclusion, because neither of them had accounted for what Victoria Hargrove actually was. Please, Holt said. The word was barely a word, more of a sound attached to a shape. Please, I have money, I have resources. Whatever the club needs, legal clearance, the property assessments dropped, whatever you want. Millions. Untraceable. I can... Victoria looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he stopped talking. Not because she told him to, but because something in the quality of her looking made further talking feel like the wrong survival strategy. She turned to Colt. Copy everything she said. Every folder, every file, email logs, financial records, everything on that machine, everything connected to it. Colt straightened. He pulled a drive case from his bag and selected the highest capacity unit. He plugged it into the machine's port and began the transfer. Rex, Victoria said, hold him. Rex kept his hand on Holt's neck, not with violent pressure, but with the absolute immovable quality of a physical fact. The kind of hold that communicates that movement is not an option through pure mechanical reality rather than threat. Victoria opened the email client on the screen beside the folder structure. She searched methodically the way she had been trained to search, not browsing but targeting, looking for the connective tissue of whatever arrangement had allowed this to function. A network like this does not operate without logistics. It does not operate without people who look the other way at the right moments. It does not operate without infrastructure that someone has to maintain. And infrastructure requires communication, and communication leaves traces. She found the thread in under 4 minutes. It was not a named thread. It was a long, intermittent exchange running back 22 months, conducted from an encrypted secondary address that Colt would later determine had been set up through a VPN and routing chain to obscure its origin. But the secondary address communicated with a visible endpoint, and the visible endpoint had a name attached to it, and the name was connected to a city identifier that Victoria recognized. She read the identifier twice to make sure she had read it correctly. Then she said, Colt. What was the badge number on the officer who came to the garage earlier? Colt looked up from the transfer progress bar. Stone had sent it by text when the patrol car pulled up at 9:15, 30 minutes after the club had left for the West Hills, the timing of which Victoria had noted and filed without comment at the time. Colt read the number from the message. Victoria looked at the identifier in the email thread. They matched. The rain outside had intensified. She could hear it now against the study's window, steadier and heavier than it had been during the ride up, the kind of Portland rain that settles in for the night and means business. She stood in Warren Holt's study and she looked at the email thread and she understood what she was looking at with a comprehensive cellular clarity. The officer had not come to the garage because of a noise complaint. He had come because the network had a fail-safe, a way of monitoring whether a loose end was developing. He had come to assess whether Emma had reported the incident through official channels, whether the club was going to generate a paper trail that required management. And he had asked about Emma with the calm, specific interest of someone who was asking about an asset, not a child. Rex, she said, without turning around. Stone recorded that badge number. Rex said, already confirmed. Good, she said. She went back to the financial records Colt had accessed on the outer layer of Holt's personal accounts. She cross-referenced the outgoing transfers. Most of them were ordinary utilities, property management, the expected expenditure profile of a high-income professional. But there were 5 recurring transfers to an account registered to a private aviation company in Monterey, California. The amounts were not small. They were not the kind of amounts associated with personal leisure travel. They were the kind of amounts associated with operational expenses, fuel ground handling, the ongoing costs of maintaining an airstrip, and the services that an airstrip provides. She stood at the desk and looked at the transfer records in the folder structure on the screen at the same time, and the full picture assembled itself in her mind with the quiet, terrible completeness of a thing that has been true for a long time and has simply been waiting for someone to look at it directly. This was not a local operation. Warren Holt was not a man with a private pathology that had escalated to a single improvised act of predation. He was a component. He was infrastructure. He used his position on the Planning Commission and his access to civic records and his institutional respectability to identify vulnerable families in marginalized districts, to compile operational information, and to feed that information into a network that extended beyond Portland, beyond Oregon, beyond the range of any single local investigation. The children in those folders were not meant to stay in Portland. They were meant to leave through an airstrip in Monterey. Victoria put one hand flat on the desk. She stood with her weight forward, looking at the screen, and she let the full scope of it sit in her body for exactly as long as it needed to sit there before she sealed it away and became functional again. This was the discipline, not the absence of feeling, but the management of it, the ability to feel the full weight of a terrible truth and then put it in the correct place where it would fuel action rather than impair it. She straightened. She looked at Warren Holt. He was looking back at her from beneath Rex's hand, and his face was the face of a man who has run out of personas. The civic authority was gone. The institutional warmth was gone. The cultivated confidence was gone. What remained was small and cornered and genuinely afraid, which was the most accurate version of Warren Holt that had ever appeared in any room he had occupied. She said the transfers to the Monterey account. How many people are in this arrangement above you? He said nothing. She waited. He said, He stopped. He seemed to understand, looking at her face, that the sentence he had started was not going to end in a way that benefited him. She waited. Colt said transfer complete, 86 folders, all email logs, full transaction history, everything. She nodded. She looked at Rex. Rex looked at Holt. There was a long moment in the study, the rain going steady against the glass, the classical music still playing at its low civilized volume from the desktop speakers, as though the room had not changed completely in the last 40 minutes, as though the social contract that the music was designed to suggest had not been entirely dissolved by the nature of what was on the laptop screen. Victoria said, "We're not going to kill you." Holt looked at her with the expression of someone who was not entirely sure whether to feel relieved. She said, "Death is a door. You walk through it and it closes. What's waiting for you on the other side of what I'm about to do stays open. It stays open for the rest of your life." She reached into the bag Colt had set on the desk and removed a heavy-duty zip tie. She looked at Rex. Rex pulled Holt out of the chair. Holt stumbled. His silk robe had come half open and he clutched it together with one hand in a reflexive gesture of dignity that was both entirely human and entirely pointless. Rex walked him to the thick support column in the center of the study, a structural element of the house's design that Victoria had identified as the right anchor point when she first read the room, and positioned him against it with his arms behind him. Holt said, "You can't do this. If you take that data to law enforcement, the manner in which it was obtained—" "I know," Victoria said. She began running the zip tie through the loop around the column. "We're not taking it to local law enforcement." Holt's voice went higher. The composure that he had been attempting to reconstruct in small pieces was gone again. "You can't. They'll know you were here. There are security records. Your security cameras are currently running a substitution loop," Colt said pleasantly from the desk. "The timestamp isn't advancing, and nobody in that guardhouse has any reason to look carefully at it tonight." Victoria finished securing Holt to the column. She pulled the printed transaction receipts that Colt had prepared, a hard copy of the offshore transfer records, 2 pages the account numbers, and amounts and dates visible and clear, and she folded them once and placed them against Holt's chest inside the robe where they would be immediately apparent to whoever found him. She stepped back. She looked at Warren Holt secured to the column in the center of his beautiful, expensive, carefully curated study, with the evidence of what he was sitting against his skin, and she looked at him for a moment with the assessing attention that she gave to completed work. Not satisfaction exactly, but the clean, functional recognition that a thing has been done correctly. She pulled her burner phone from her jacket It was a prepaid unit purchased in cash 3 weeks ago at a pharmacy on the other side of the city, one of four she rotated through on a schedule. She had a number memorized. She had memorized it 4 years ago in a different context and had carried it since then the way she carried certain other pieces of information, not because she expected to use it, but because information is infrastructure, and infrastructure is what keeps people alive. The number was for FBI Special Agent Carl Devlin, Regional Coordinator for the Bureau's Anti-Trafficking Task Force. She knew Devlin by reputation from a prior situation involving the club's freight arrangement, a situation in which Devlin had conducted himself as a straight-line professional in a field full of institutional compromises. She dialed. It picked up on the second ring. Devlin. She spoke at a low pitch with deliberate modifications to her natural cadence, flattening her vowels and slowing her consonants in the way she had learned to do in situations that required voice anonymization. She said, Agent Devlin, I'm going to give you one address and one set of instructions. Do not respond until I'm finished. A pause. Then I'm listening. 4420 Crestview Drive in the West Hills, Portland. The target is Warren Holt, chairman of the Portland City Planning Commission. He is secured in the second-floor study. His laptop is open and the encryption is disabled. The folder structure is self-explanatory. Physical transaction receipts are on his person. He is connected to an active network operating through a private airstrip in Monterey. There is a Portland PD badge number linked to the operation through his email chain. The security system on the property is currently running a loop. My source will kill it remotely once your team is inside and the arrest is confirmed. Move now and you will have clean access. Wait and the window becomes complicated. Devlin said, Who concerned citizen? She said. Move now. She ended the call. She folded the phone in half against the edge of the desk, the casing cracking along the seam, the SIM breaking free. She pocketed the pieces. She looked at Colt. He nodded once the drives were secure. The machine was back to its original screen configuration. Their digital presence in Holt systems had been scrubbed back to baseline. He closed the laptop to the angle it had been at when they entered. She looked at Rex. He was already at the door. She looked one last time at Warren Holt. He was looking back at her. His face had gone through several different things in the last hour and had arrived at something that was not quite any of its prior expressions. Not the authority, not the fear, not the calculation. It was the face of a man who has understood in the part of his mind that is below argument that the world he occupied has ended and the world he is entering has already begun, and that the transition between the two has been managed entirely by the woman standing in front of him, and that there is nothing left to negotiate. Victoria said quietly and without theater, You thought she was unprotected. She was never unprotected. She was never going to be unprotected. She turned away from him and walked to the door, and Rex fell in behind her, and Colt came last, and they moved back through the hallway in the same careful silence in which they had arrived down the staircase, through the utility room, through the garage, out into the rain. Somewhere below them, descending toward the city, the wail of federal vehicles had not yet begun. But it would. In 11 minutes it would. Victoria Hargrove pulled on her helmet and started the engine of her machine and rolled out into the dark, wet streets of the West Hills. And she rode back down toward the city with the rain against her face and the data in Colt's bag, and the weight of what she had found in Warren Holt's study sitting in her chest where it was going to sit for a long time. She thought of the names in the folders. She thought of Emma asleep behind glass. She rode. They came down out of the West Hills the way water comes down. Not fast, not dramatic, but with the quiet, patient certainty of something that has gravity on its side and does not need to announce itself. The three machines descended through the switchbacks in the rain headlights off for the first quarter mile, running on the ambient glow of the city below them, which lay spread out across the basin in its usual nighttime configuration of amber and white, and the occasional blue pulse of something official moving through the grid. Victoria rode in front. Warren Holt was filed away closed. The decision had been made and executed. The federal machinery was running now. She had put it in motion and stepped away from it, the way you step away from something you have set correctly and trust to run. Holt was not her problem anymore. He was Carl Devlin's problem, and the federal prosecutor's problem, and eventually the problem of every institution that had let him operate behind the facade of civic responsibility for as long as he had operated there. She had handed him to those institutions not because she trusted them completely, but because she understood what she was, a woman who could ride into the West Hills and come back out with the evidence that broke a network open, but not a woman who could also raise Emma correctly if she carried the weight of everything that justice required. You do what you can do. You hand off what belongs to someone else. You come home. What she thought about descending through the rain was the names in the folders. She thought about them the way she thought about things that she was not yet in a position to act on, held at a specific distance, acknowledged, not processed, filed under the category of things that required a different kind of response than anything available to her tonight. The folders were on Colt's drives. The drives were in Colt's bag. Agent Devlin had the address and the laptop and the institutional machinery of the federal government's anti-trafficking infrastructure. The names in the folders were, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, in the hands of people whose entire professional purpose was to respond to exactly what those names represented. She had done what she could do. The rest was not hers to carry alone. This was also something she had learned not in the Army, but afterward in the harder and less structured curriculum of raising a child without a partner, of running a club, without a formal hierarchy that recognized her authority of making decisions in ambiguous situations where the right answer was not available in any manual and the consequences of the wrong answer were not abstract. She had learned that a person can only carry what belongs to them, that picking up weight that belongs to the world at large is not virtue. It is a way of breaking yourself without solving anything. She carried what was hers. Emma was hers. The garage came into view at 10:48, the exterior loading dock light casting its familiar amber cone across the wet asphalt, the corrugated steel walls dark and anonymous behind it. To anyone passing on the street, it was exactly what it appeared to be, an industrial building at rest, closed for the night, unremarkable in the way that all the buildings on this block were unremarkable, which was precisely why it had been chosen and why it had functioned as what it was for 12 years without significant interference. Victoria pulled into the covered bay and cut the engine. Rex and Colt pulled in beside her and they dismounted in silence. Colt had the bag over his shoulder and his face carried the specific exhaustion of sustained, high-focus work, the look of someone whose cognitive resources had been running at full capacity for hours and were beginning to register the cost. Rex was moving the way Rex always moved after an operation, with the unhurried, deliberate economy of a man who knows that the adrenaline is going to cost him something in the morning and is already pacing against it. Victoria pulled off her helmet. She stood for a moment in the covered bay, with the rain coming down just beyond the overhang's edge, a curtain of gray water 3 feet from her face, and she breathed in the smell of the garage and the rain and the motor oil and the particular cold that comes with October nights in Portland, and she let herself be exactly where she was. Then she went inside. Stone was where she had left him. He was standing outside the office door with his back to the wall and his arms loose at his sides and his eyes on the garage floor, and he looked up when she came through the interior door with the specific assessing attention of a man who has been in a holding pattern for 3 hours and needs to know that the holding pattern is over. She met his eyes. She gave him the small, single nod that communicated what he needed to know. Stone breathed it out through his nose. He stepped aside from the door. Victoria turned the key in the lock and eased the door open. The office was warm and dim, the single desk lamp on the far side casting a low yellow light across the leather sofa where Emma lay. The wool blanket had been rearranged at some point in the last several hours, pulled up higher, tucked more carefully around the small body underneath it, and Victoria understood without asking that Stone had done this, that in the long hours of standing outside the door, he had checked on Emma and adjusted the blanket and stood for a moment in the doorway of the office, looking at the sleeping child the way a man looks at the thing he has been assigned to protect. She said nothing about it. It went into the place where she kept the things that mattered without ceremony and without comment. She sat on the edge of the sofa as she had sat earlier in the evening, and she looked at her daughter. Emma was deeply asleep in the way that children sleep after genuine physical and emotional expenditure. Not the light responsive sleep of a normal evening, but the anchored heavy sleep of a body that has processed something significant and has gone deep to recover from it. Her face in sleep was the face of a child without agenda, without fear, without any of the awareness that the waking hours require. It was the purest version of her, the version that Victoria saw in these late quiet moments, and that she stored with great care in the part of herself that she kept separate from everything operational, everything dangerous, everything that the rest of her life required. She reached out and pushed a strand of Emma's hair back from her forehead gently, the way you touch something that is precious without wanting to disturb it. Emma stirred, her eyes open partway, dark and unfocused, doing the slow blinking work of coming up from deep sleep. "Mama," she said. Her voice was thick with sleep and entirely without alarm. The word was not a question. It was a greeting, a confirmation, the simple act of identifying a known presence and finding it exactly where it should be. "Right here," Victoria said. Emma blinked again. Her eyes opened a little more. She looked at Victoria with the serious, considering expression she wore when she was working out something that mattered to her. "Did you fix it?" she asked. Victoria looked at her daughter's face. She thought about the study in the West Hills and the drives in Colt's bag and the federal vehicles that were by now at 4420 Crestview Drive. She thought about Agent Carl Devlin, who was a straight-line professional and who would do what straight-line professionals do with what they had been given. She thought about the names in the folders and what was going to happen to the network they represented now that its primary local node had been compromised and the FBI's anti-trafficking infrastructure had its teeth in it. She thought about Emma, who had run exactly as she had been taught to run, who had cut through Mrs. Gable's alley and made it home and told her mother exactly what she needed to know in exactly the order she needed to know it. "Yeah, baby," Victoria said. "It's fixed. The bad man is gone. He's not coming back." Emma looked at her for a moment with the particular directness that 7-year-olds bring to the assessment of adult statements, the innate, unsophisticated honesty detector that children carry before the world teaches them social deference. Whatever she read in Victoria's face satisfied her, because she settled back against the sofa cushion and pulled the blanket up to her chin. "I knew you would, Mama," she said. Her eyes were already closing again. "You always fix things." Victoria sat on the edge of the sofa until Emma's breathing deepened again, and she was certain her daughter was fully back in sleep. Then she stood, turned off the desk lamp, and eased the door closed behind her. She stood in the narrow corridor outside the office for a moment in the dark. Through the glass, Emma was a small shape under the wool blanket, the ambient light from the garage catching the gold of her hair. Victoria turned toward the garage floor. Rex and Colton Stone were at the central workbench. Nobody had turned the radio back on. The overhead fluorescents were down to half the way they ran late at night, when the garage was in its between-hour state and in the lower light. The three men looked like what they were: tired, serious people at the end of something difficult, occupying the particular space between completion and decompression that every hard thing requires. Colt had the drives on the bench in front of him, laid out in their anti-static cases with the care of someone who understands that what is on them is no longer just data, but evidence, testimony, the material record of something that had been operating in the dark for a long time. Victoria sat on a stool at the end of the bench. Rex pushed a mug toward her. It was cold. She wrapped her hands around it anyway. She said Devlin will move it tonight. The laptop is open, the data is visible, the receipts are physical. The chain of custody for what he finds is clean. It was called in by an anonymous tip. The evidence is in plain sight on the property of the subject. Nothing we touch changes what Devlin finds when he walks in there. Rex said the badge number. Stone pulled his phone from his pocket and set it on the bench without a word. On the screen was the number he had logged when the officer appeared at the garage earlier in the evening, photographed against his own palm for documentation. That number is in Holt's email chain, Victoria said. Devlin will find it. When he does, it goes to internal affairs and it goes to the federal oversight component of the task force simultaneously. One corrupt officer in a network like this doesn't operate alone. The thread will pull, Colt said, and the Monterey connection. Victoria looked at him. The airstrip transfers were in the financial records. That's a federal jurisdiction issue, by definition, interstate, potentially international. Devlin's task force has standing to escalate to the full bureau apparatus. It won't stay in Portland. It won't stay in Oregon. Rex was quiet for a moment. He looked at the drives on the bench. He said the kids in those files. Victoria said Devlin works this one case and it breaks the network open. Every child in those folders is now the subject of a federal investigation rather than a local report that goes nowhere. That is the best outcome available. That is the outcome we created tonight. Rex absorbed this. His jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was processing something he wanted to argue with and finding that the argument didn't hold. He picked up his own mug and looked at the bottom of it and set it down. Stone said the club's property case. Victoria said, when Warren Holt is arrested by the FBI on trafficking charges, his chairmanship of the Planning Commission ends. Every action taken during his tenure that is connected to his capacity as chairman becomes subject to review. The structural assessment filings, the zoning challenges, the inspection orders, they don't disappear automatically, but they lose their advocate, and without an advocate, they sit in committee indefinitely. Drummond will file a motion to vacate within 48 hours of the arrest. I'll call him in the morning. Rex looked at her. Just like that, he said, it just stops. Victoria said, nothing just stops. We worked for 8 months through proper channels. Drummond built a record. The legal foundation for a motion to vacate has been building since the first filing. Tonight changed the political context, not the legal argument. The legal argument was already there. Rex looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, you know what I mean. She did know what he meant. He meant that they had ridden into the West Hills and come out the other side, and the man who had been grinding the club down through the machinery of civic government for 8 months was now secured to a pillar with his crimes in plain view and the FBI on the way. And it had happened in 3 hours, and it had happened because Victoria had seen the shape of it correctly when Rex was still reading it as a political pressure tactic, and it had happened because she had not acted on the first interpretation but had waited for the data, and it had happened because she had made the decision about Devlin rather than the decision that Rex and Stone and every instinct in the room had been oriented toward. He meant that he understood in a way he had not fully understood before tonight how she thought and why she thought that way and what it produced. She didn't comment on it. She said, the drives stay here until I determine the right disposition. Nobody talks about tonight, not to associates, not to prospects, not to anyone outside this room. What happened in the West Hills happened in the West Hills. It ends there. Everyone at the bench understood what that meant. They had all at various points in their lives operated in situations where the correct response to a completed action was the permanent silence of the people who had been part of it. This was not a culture of confession. It was a culture of accountability to each other and discretion from everyone else, and it had held for a long time. Stone said understood. Colt said understood. Rex said nothing. He picked up the cold mug and looked at it and put it down and looked at Victoria and said, you should sleep. She looked at him. He said, Emma's going to be up at 6. She's going to want pancakes, and she's going to want to show you something she learned at school, and she's going to want you present. You should sleep. Victoria looked at Rex Malone, who was 48 years old and built like a piece of heavy equipment and had never once in 11 years of their association said anything that was not either practically useful or entirely honest. She looked at him and thought about the fact that this was the same man who had 4 hours ago been standing in Warren Holt's driveway in the rain looking at a house and waiting for a woman he had ridden with for over a decade to tell him what they were going to do next. who had followed her into that house and stood beside her without flinching, and who was now in the aftermath telling her to sleep because her daughter was going to want pancakes in the morning. She said, "You're right." She stood and put the cold mug on the bench and looked at the drives in their cases. "Colt," she said, "secure those." He nodded. She looked around the garage once the shovel head in its corner, the Road King still on the lift, the tools on their hooks, the coffee machine that would kick on at 6, and then she walked to the office, unlocked the door, and went inside. She didn't turn on the lamp. She sat in the armchair beside the sofa in the dark, listening to Emma breathe, and she stayed there for a long time. The next 14 days moved the way the aftermath of serious things always moves on two tracks, simultaneously the public track and the private one, each proceeding at its own pace and according to its own logic, occasionally intersecting in ways that required management. On the public track, the events in the West Hills generated exactly the sequence Victoria had anticipated when she placed the call to Devlin. The FBI arrived at 442 Crestview Drive at 11:03 on the night of October 14th. 11 minutes after she had ended the call, which meant Devlin had moved within 60 seconds of hanging up and had had vehicles rolling before she was halfway down the hill. The arrest of Warren Holt on federal charges was processed overnight and became public information by the following morning, at which point it ceased to be something Victoria needed to manage and became something the city needed to manage, which was a different and considerably more chaotic process. She watched it from a distance. The news coverage in the first 48 hours was careful, the kind of careful that reflects legal constraint rather than editorial restraint. The language of reporters who know they have a significant story and are being held to verified facts, while the verification process catches up with the magnitude of what has been found. The words used were procedural, arrested, charged, federal inquiry, ongoing investigation, cooperating sources. The names of specific charges were not yet public. The scope of what was on the laptop was not yet public. But the scope became public in stages the way these things do, and each stage was larger than the one before it. On the fourth day after the arrest, a brief item in the state news feed noted that 3 additional individuals had been taken into federal custody in connection with the investigation. No names, no specific charges. On the 7th day, a longer piece ran in the Oregonian, sourced entirely to anonymous federal officials, describing the broad outline of a network that had operated across multiple Pacific Coast jurisdictions using civic infrastructure and institutional access to identify vulnerable children in low-income communities. The piece was careful. It was also devastating. On the 9th day, a reporter at a Portland television station broke a story about a Portland Police Department officer whose badge number had appeared in materials seized during the federal investigation. The officer was identified by name. He had been placed on administrative leave pending review. The department issued a statement using the language that departments use when they are trying to communicate institutional seriousness while managing institutional exposure, and the statement said very little while being very long. On the 11th day, the federal investigation was formally elevated to a multi-district task force with bureau resources drawn from 3 regional offices. There was a brief press conference. Devlin did not speak at the press conference. He was not the kind of man who sought cameras, but his name appeared in the official statement as the coordinating agent, and Victoria read it in the way she read official statements, which was to extract the actual information from the institutional language and discard the rest. 4 additional arrests had been made in connection with the Monterey airstrip operation. The airstrip itself had been the subject of an emergency federal warrant and was under active investigation. The network, as described in the official language of the press conference, was characterized as extensive. That word, in the context of what Victoria had seen on the laptop screen, meant something specific and serious, and she understood it to mean that what Devlin had found was not limited to what she had found, that the drives she had handed him were a door and not a wall, and that he had walked through it and found considerably more on the other side. She thought for a long time about the names in the folders. She thought about what it meant that those names were now in federal hands rather than sitting in encrypted files behind an institutional facade. And she thought about what it would mean for the families attached to those names, and she thought about the limitations of what the federal process could and could not do. And she accepted those limitations the way she accepted the limitations of everything she had ever been part of. Not with resignation, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that the available tools are the available tools, that the alternative to imperfect action is the perfect inaction that guarantees the worst outcome, and that she had done what she could do with what she had. She thought about this for as long as it needed thinking about. Then she put it in the place where it belonged and moved forward. Philip Drummond called on the morning of the 12th day. His voice had its usual measured quality, but underneath the measure was something she had not heard in it before, a specific, careful satisfaction that a meticulous man allows himself when a long and complicated effort has resolved in the correct direction. "Victoria," he said, "I have news from the Planning Commission." She said, "Tell me." He said, "With the vacancy created by the chairman's arrest and the subsequent administrative review of all actions taken during his tenure, the commission's interim director has moved to suspend all outstanding compliance proceedings initiated by the prior chairman pending ethics review. That includes the structural assessment order on iron and chrome customs. The suspension is indefinite. The interim director's office contacted me this morning with formal notification." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She said, "How long before they attempt to reinstate?" Drummond said, "In my opinion, given the scope of the federal investigation and the political environment around the commission right now, any action that can be characterized as connected to the prior chairman's agenda is going to remain dormant for the foreseeable future. If they move to reinstate anything we have standing to challenge on the basis of the ethics review, I would be genuinely surprised if this comes back to us in any form we need to worry about." Victoria said, "Thank you, Philip." He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am asking as your attorney and therefore underprivileged, and that the question is entirely hypothetical and requires no answer of any kind." She waited. He said, "Is there anything about the timing and nature of recent events that would suggest any vulnerability for the club?" She said no. Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. I'll have the formal suspension documentation to you by end of day." She thanked him and ended the call. She was standing at the workbench. When she ended it, the shovelhead in front of her in its usual state of patient disassembly. The garage was in its morning rhythm, coffee-made tools coming off hooks, the muted sound of a news program from the small television on the shelf above the parts storage room that Stone watched while he ran his morning inventory. Rex was at the far end of the bench with a set of primary cases spread out on a clean cloth. He had heard her side of the call. He was looking at the primary cases with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the best response to good news is the continuation of ordinary work. She said, "The assessment order is suspended." Rex picked up one of the primary cases and held it up to the light. He examined it for a moment. He set it down. He said, "Good." That was all. Stone came out of the storage room with a clipboard and looked at her over the top of it. He said, "Coffee's been ready for 20 minutes. She crossed the garage and poured herself a mug. Colt arrived at 7:15 with his laptop bag and a breakfast sandwich and sat down at his station and had 4 windows open within 30 seconds of sitting down, which was the most normal thing that had happened in the garage in 2 weeks, and which she found unexpectedly to be genuinely comforting. The 14th day was a Sunday. Emma had no school, and on Sundays when there was no school, the routine was unhurried in a way that weekday mornings couldn't be. Victoria made pancakes in the apartment above the garage, the 2-bedroom space she had built out 4 years ago, when it became clear that the arrangement of living 20 minutes away from the building she was responsible for was an arrangement that didn't serve anyone well. The kitchen was small but functional, and it faced east, and on Sunday mornings in October, the gray Portland light came through the east window in a way that, if you were inclined towards such things, could be called beautiful. Emma sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas with a coloring book open and a cup of orange juice, and described in considerable detail and with the comprehensive narrative commitment of a 7-year-old a project her class was doing about Oregon animals. The beaver, the black bear, the western meadowlark, which was the state bird and which Emma had strong opinions about in terms of coloring accuracy, the coloring book's version being in Emma's assessment, not the right shade of yellow. Victoria stood at the stove and made the pancakes and listened. She listened the way she had trained herself to listen on Sunday mornings fully, without the divided attention of someone running a background process without any part of her mind allocated elsewhere. The ability to be entirely in a kitchen with a 7-year-old describing the western meadowlark was something she had worked for actively for years. It was not a natural state. It was a practiced one. The mind that runs military intelligence operations and manages club logistics and processes threat assessments does not quiet itself automatically. You quiet it by choice, by discipline, by repeated insistence that this kitchen and this child and this cup of orange juice are the actual thing and that everything else is in service of this. She put the first pancakes on a plate and set it in front of Emma. Emma colored for a moment with her left hand while eating with her right, which was a coordination feat that Victoria had given up commenting on. Mama, Emma said, "Yes. Are those men going to jail? The bad ones on the news." Victoria turned from the stove. She looked at her daughter. Emma was looking at the coloring book with the focused expression of someone who is asking a question while appearing to concentrate on something else, which was a technique Emma had been deploying since she was 5, and which Victoria recognized as the approach her daughter used when she was asking about something that felt significant. "Yes," Victoria said. "They are." Emma colored for a moment. "Because of what they did?" "Because of what they did," Victoria confirmed. Emma put down the yellow pencil and picked up a brown one and considered the beaver on the opposite page. She said, "Do the police know about the man who tried to talk to me?" Victoria crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her daughter. She said, "The people who handle things like that know. The right people know. And they're going to make sure nothing like that ever happens again." Emma looked at her over the coloring book. Her dark eyes had the direct, uncomplicated quality. They had always had the quality that made it impossible to give her anything less than the truth, and that had over 7 years made Victoria a more honest person than she might otherwise have been. "You took care of it," Emma said. "It was not a question." Victoria looked at her daughter. She thought about 2 weeks ago and the sound of the garage door and the particular quality of Emma's crying and the cold, complete transition that had happened in her chest in that moment. She thought about the cameras and the dealership decal and the folder structure on the laptop and the zip ties and the rain coming down in the West Hills and the number she had dialed and the words she had said and the way she had turned away from Warren Holt and walked out of the room without looking back. She thought about what it meant to take care of something, not in the sense of resolution, not in the sense of a problem solved and filed away, but in the ongoing, active, renewable sense, the commitment to remain present and capable and oriented toward the protection of the person sitting across this table with the coloring book and the orange juice, and the entirely accurate instinct that her mother had done what needed doing. "I took care of it," Victoria said. Emma nodded once with the gravity of someone filing an important piece of information in the correct location. She picked up the yellow pencil again and returned to the meadowlark. "Good," she said. "The yellow is still wrong, though." Victoria looked at the coloring book. She looked at the bird. She said, "I think you might be right." Emma handed her a pencil. It was a slightly different shade of yellow, warmer, closer to the real thing. "Fix it," Emma said. Victoria took the pencil. She leaned forward over the coloring book, her forearms on the kitchen table, and she had just begun to work on the wing when she heard footsteps on the back staircase, the external staircase that connected the garage to the apartment's rear entrance, the one that the club used when they needed to reach her directly, and the front way around the building was inconvenient. 2 knocks, measured, a little uncertain. Victoria looked at Emma. Emma looked at the door. Victoria crossed the kitchen and opened it. Rex Malone was standing on the landing in the October morning, wearing his leather cut over a flannel shirt, his dark beard carrying a few drops of rain from the short walk across the lot. He was holding a brown paper bag in one hand. He looked approximately as comfortable as a man of his dimensions could look, standing in a domestic doorway on a Sunday morning, which was not very comfortable at all. He said, "Mrs. Gables." The woman put in extra snickerdoodles. He held up the bag slightly. Said to tell Emma they were for being brave. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the West Hills and the rain and the silence on the ride back down. She thought about the cold mug he had pushed toward her at the workbench and the look on his face when she had said she was going to do this right, and the way he had, without another word, put on his cut and followed her. She opened the door wider. Rex came in. He ducked slightly under the door frame out of habit, though the clearance was sufficient. He looked at the kitchen, the stove with the pan still on it, the half-eaten pancakes, the coloring book spread across the table, and he absorbed the ordinary Saturday morning reality of it with the expression of a man who does not often find himself in kitchens on Sunday mornings and is recalibrating accordingly. Emma looked at him over her coloring book. She held it up and turned it toward him. She said, "I'm doing Oregon animals. This is the meadowlark, but the yellow is wrong." Rex pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He was far too large for the chair, and he knew it, and sat in it anyway, with the deliberate ease of someone who has decided that the situation calls for it. He looked at the coloring book. He looked at it for a long, serious time. The way he looked at engine components, he was evaluating with genuine attention, without pretense. He said, "That yellow is exactly right." Emma considered this with the full weight of her critical faculties. She looked at the bird. She looked at Rex. She said, "Mama helped." Rex looked at Victoria. Something moved through his face briefly, something that did not have a clean name. The expression of a man who has ridden hard into the dark and come back to a kitchen table on a Sunday morning and found that this is what the writing was for. The whole long, dirty, necessary work of it. All the decisions made in the rain. All the years of doing things the hard way because the hard way was the right way. It came down always to this: a small girl with a coloring book and a paper bag of cookies and a mother who had never once, not in 11 years, made a decision she wasn't willing to own completely. He looked back at the coloring book. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." He set the paper bag on the table. Emma opened it immediately with the efficient interest of a child who understands that the investigation of paper bags is a matter of some priority. She looked inside. She looked at Rex. She said, "There are a lot of snickerdoodles." "Mrs. Gable was generous," Rex said. Emma took one and began eating it with the same focused satisfaction she brought to all serious activities. She turned back to the coloring book and picked up the pencil again. Victoria stood at the stove and put the pan back on the heat and began making more pancakes. The kitchen was warm. The east window was doing its gray October thing, the light coming in flat and steady, filling the room without drama. Outside, the rain had paused in the way Portland rain sometimes pauses on weekend mornings. Not gone, just considering holding its position while the city does what the city does underneath it. From below through the floor came the sounds of the garage waking up. The coffee machine, the side door, Stone's boots on the concrete, the slow, deliberate circuit of the morning perimeter check. Colt's chair rolling back from the tech station. The ordinary sounds of a place that is still standing, still running, still intact. Victoria stood at the stove with a spatula in her hand and listened to those sounds and felt the specific functional weight of his life held together through discipline and loyalty and the willingness to do, when it was necessary, what needed to be done without flinching from the cost of it. Mama Emma said, "You're not fixing the bird." Victoria looked at the coloring book on the table. She looked at the warm yellow pencil Emma was holding out toward her. She set the spatula down, crossed the kitchen, and sat down. She took the pencil. She looked at the meadowlark, at the careful outlines of it, at the way Emma had already begun to get the body right even if the color was off. She thought briefly about Warren Holt and his study and the drives and the federal machinery grinding forward without her. She thought about the names in the folders and Devlin and all the things in motion that she had set in motion and could now allow to run without her hand on them. Then she put all of it away. She leaned over the coloring book and began to color the bird the right shade of yellow, and outside the window the Portland morning continued in its gray, unhurried way, and the pancakes smelled like Sunday. And Emma's voice ran on about the beaver and the black bear, and the particular shade of brown that the coloring book had gotten wrong as well. And Rex sat across the table in a chair too small for him, eating a snickerdoodle with great dignity, and the garage below them held the line the way it had always held the line, and in the kitchen above it, a woman who had ridden into the dark and come back sat at a table with her daughter and filled in the wings of a small bird with the right color, patient and present and entirely exactly where she was supposed to be.